This is the story the textbooks left out. The civil rights and Black Power movements are usually told through the voices of famous men at the microphone. But the people who knocked on doors, taught the freedom schools, organized the boycotts, and held the movement together were overwhelmingly women. Analysis to recover those women. From Mary McLeod Bethune to the Black Panthers, from Rosa Parks to the Combahee River Collective, it traces African American women across half a century of organizing. These are the sisters who, in Gwendolyn Brooks's words, conducted their blooming in the noise and whip of the whirlwind. The editors argue that African American women were not supporting actors in the freedom struggle. They were its backbone. For decades, scholarship named the charismatic men and overlooked the organizers who built the base beneath them. This book corrects that record. It carries the story past 1965 into the Black Power years and the rise of a distinct Black feminist consciousness, ground that earlier histories ignored. Three kinds of evidence are braided together: eyewitness testimony from the women themselves, careful biography, and socio-political analysis of organizations and movements. The result reveals a double burden these women carried, what Mary Church Terrell called the double handicap of race and sex, and the extraordinary leadership they forged while bearing it. The editors open with a poem by Gwendolyn Brooks and a long view of history. From the moment African women survived the Middle Passage, they were caught in a whirlwind of forces beyond their control, doing back-breaking labor, enduring sexual violence, and creating families that sustained the race. Historians now mark a civil rights era from the 1954 Brown decision to the 1965 Selma March, but the roots of Black Power run deeper through Marcus Garvey in the 1920s, A. Philip Randolph's March on Washington movement, and the Nation of Islam. This volume grew from a 1997 conference at Temple University, funded by the Ford Foundation and rooted in Collier-Thomas's work at the Bethune Museum and Archives. Its aim? To let Black women's own voices finally be heard. Why assemble this book at all? The editors answer with a quiet indictment of their own field. For decades, the standard histories of the movement were written around charismatic men who moved coast to coast, setting the national agenda, while the women who built and held the local base went unnamed. Even the newer studies that did recover women, by Lynn Olson, Belinda Robnett, and others, stopped at 1970 and never reckoned with how Black Power reshaped Black women's politics and feminism in the decade that followed. Sisters in the Struggle sets out to close that gap. It braids three kinds of evidence: eyewitness testimony, biography, and socio-political analysis into a single argument that to write the women back in is not to add a footnote, but to tell the freedom struggle correctly for the first time. Long before Montgomery, Black women built the organizations and the arguments the movement would inherit. Part 1 recovers that hidden groundwork. Mary McLeod Bethune, born in 1875 to formerly enslaved parents in rural South Carolina, became one of the most powerful Black women in American history. The 15th of 17 children, she turned a tiny schoolhouse into Bethune-Cookman College. She founded the National Council of Negro Women in 1935 and led Negro affairs in Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, convening the informal Black cabinet of African Americans in government. Aubrey Williams called her a damn good politician who knew how to use people for good ends. The Ku Klux Klan marched twice past her Daytona Beach school, once because she sat in a whites-only railway car, once to stop her registering Black women to vote. She would not be intimidated. For her stature among the people, she was called the First Lady of the Race. The book reprints Bethune's 1936 speech, Closed Doors, delivered to white Northern audiences. To be Black, she said, was the greatest known handicap. To be a Black woman, greater still. She cataloged the doors shut against her people: hospitals that sent Black mothers to the cellar, schools open 4 months a year against the white child's 10, labor unions that barred skilled Black workers, railroad cars that were filthy and Jim Crow, a navy where a qualified man could rise no higher than mess boy. Even in death, she said, the Black man's ashes could not mingle with the white man's. Yet her metaphor was hope. Doors that are shut can be opened with tact, skill, and persistence, and those that will not open, African Americans will batter down. The Negro asks the privilege of entering every door. Bethune did not act alone. Franklin and Collier-Thomas trace a dense network of Black women's organizations between 1915 and 1950, the National Association of Colored Women, the National Council of Negro Women, and the Alpha Kappa Alpha Sororities Nonpartisan Council. Through the New Jersey State Federation of Colored Women and groups like it, women built social welfare services in Black communities and lobbied legislatures to end segregation in schools, housing, voting, and employment. They sent petitions to governors, telegrams to presidents, and delegations to constitutional conventions. For these club women, there was no conflict between feminist purpose and civil rights work. Activism became part of their very identity. They carried the dignified model of the club movement, lifting as we climb, into decades of patient, unrecognized institution building. During the Second World War, these women turned their organizations toward the federal government. The AKA Nonpartisan Council campaigned until, in October 1944, the Navy agreed to admit Black women into the waves on an integrated basis. They pushed for a permanent Fair Employment Practices Committee after Roosevelt's Executive Order 8802 and pressed Truman until his Executive Order 9981 desegregated the armed forces in 1948. The National Council of Negro Women issued a 10-point program and ran voter registration drives that helped deliver Truman's narrow 1948 victory. Black women, the council declared, had a threefold stake in civil rights for themselves, their husbands, and their children. By the mid-1950s, when the Montgomery bus boycott began, these seasoned organizations were ready to be thrust into the modern movement. Ella Baker is often remembered as a supporting actor, but Barbara Ransby calls her the single most influential person in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. James Forman said, "Many people knew the light that was SNCC without ever knowing the spark that was Ella Baker." From the 1930s until her death in 1986, she worked in more than 30 organizations. She was national director of Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference, but grew impatient with its top-down, preacher-centered style. At 57, she convened the young sit-in students at Shaw University in 1960 and urged them to form their own independent group. Her philosophy was radical democracy. Strong people don't need strong leaders. Leadership, she insisted, meant developing the capacity of ordinary people to lead themselves. Ransby traces Baker's politics to her North Carolina girlhood and, above all, to her mother, Georgiana, a leader in the Black Baptist women's missionary movement. There, Ella watched competent, confident women run their own meetings, manage their own money, and apply faith as service. She graduated from Shaw University in 1927 and moved to Harlem, where she condemned Italy's invasion of Ethiopia, organized the Young Negroes Cooperative League, and taught consumer politics for the WPA. She drew lifelong strength from a circle of activist women, among them Polly Murray and the YWCA's Dorothy Height. Committed more to a cause than to any organization, Baker was often the only woman or the only Black person in the room, and she never stopped challenging male dominance and class elitism inside the movement itself. 3 women who lived the movement tell their own stories, because the voices of Black women have so rarely been allowed to speak for themselves.
People always say Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat because she was tired. That isn't true, she insists. She was 42, no more tired than usual after a working day. The only tired she was tired of giving in. On December 1, 1955, the driver, James Blake, threatened to have her arrested. "You may do that," she answered. 2 officers took her to jail. One told her, "The law is the law, and you're under arrest." She was not frightened, only resigned, prepared to accept whatever she had to face. Parks was no accidental heroine. She had served 12 years as secretary of the Montgomery NAACP. As organizer, E.D. Nixon put it, looking at her in jail, "My God, look what segregation has put in my hands." She was the perfect plaintiff.
The Montgomery bus boycott was launched overnight by women. Joanne Robinson and the Women's Political Council learned of Parks' arrest, met at midnight, cut a mimeograph stencil at Alabama State, and ran off 35,000 handbills calling for a one-day boycott on December 5th, the day of her trial. "The next time, it may be you," the leaflet warned, "or your daughter or your mother." Ministers, including a young Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy, took up the call from their pulpits. On a dark, rain-threatened Monday, the buses ran nearly empty. Black-owned cabs charged a dime. "We surprised ourselves," Nixon said. The boycott lasted over a year, until the Supreme Court ordered the buses integrated, and Parks, who lost her job, kept working, dispatching cars and raising money the whole time. Charlene Hunter grew up in Atlanta, dreaming of becoming a journalist, raised by a grandmother who read 3 newspapers a day. A delegation from the Atlanta Committee for Cooperative Action recruited her and the brilliant scholar-athlete Hamilton Holmes to integrate a white college. They aimed for the jewel in the system's crown, the University of Georgia, which had admitted no black student in its 176-year history. For a year and a half, the state stalled, claiming the dormitories were simply full. A formidable NAACP legal team, Donald Hollowell, Vernon Jordan, and Constance Baker Motley, dismantled the lie in federal court, trapping the registrar into admitting he would accept a qualified Negro. On January 6, 1961, Judge Boodle ordered them admitted. As Hunter's mother said when the appeal failed too, "God is good, isn't he?" On January 9, 1961, Hunter walked onto campus, 19 years old, and making a history she had not sought. Within days, a mob gathered outside her dormitory, swollen by fans bitter over a basketball loss. Bricks shattered her window, the only lit one in the building. Tear gas seeped through the halls. The university suspended her, and Holmes, supposedly for their own safety. As a dean led her out through a semicircle of jeering students, one flung a quarter at her feet and sneered, "Here, nigger, change my sheets." Hunter was angry, but not afraid. The 23rd Psalm her grandmother had taught her came back to her like a suit of armor. The courts ordered them back, and they returned under heavy guard. 2 years later, she graduated, and Georgia's schools had begun to open behind her. Dorothy Height, president of the National Council of Negro Women, sat in the Council of United Civil Rights Leadership beside King, Randolph, Wilkins, Young, and Farmer. Her NCNW Educational Foundation quietly funded scholarships for 114 activists, among them Stokely Carmichael and Marion Barry. Yet when the 1963 March on Washington was planned, not one woman was allowed to give a major speech. Height and Anna Arnold Hedgeman pressed Bayard Rustin and were told again and again, "Women are included. Every group has women in it." They offered names. The organizers claimed they didn't know whom to choose. Mahalia Jackson could sing, but no woman would speak on behalf of women. The leaders gave them seats on the platform instead. As Height put it, the omission was deliberate. The exclusion at the march became a turning point. At an NCNW leadership conference that November, the lawyer and activist Polly Murray delivered a speech.
the Negro woman in the quest for equality, that named what had happened. It was bitterly humiliating, she said, to see Black women accorded little more than token recognition in the historic march. The omission of women from the speeches and the White House delegation was deliberate. Black women had long overlooked sexism to win racial equality, but they would no longer suffer it silently. Haidt and others revived Mary Church Terrell's phrase, the double handicap of race and sex. Most people remember King's dream. For the women who built the movement, the march was a new and lasting awakening to their own worth.
Away from the cameras, grassroots women turned sharecroppers and washerwomen into voters and leaders. This is the architecture of the movement's base.
Born in Charleston in 1898 to a formerly enslaved father and a Haitian-raised mother, Septima Poinsett Clark gave 60 years to literacy and the vote. A teacher fired for belonging to the NAACP, she found her life's work at the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee, where she built the Citizenship schools. Their motto was literacy and liberation. Clark taught illiterate rural adults to read and write so they could pass the registration tests, then trained barely literate farmers and washerwomen to become teachers themselves. When Tennessee shut Highlander down, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference adopted the program and made Clark its director. Andrew Young called her Citizenship schools the base on which the whole civil rights movement was built. Taylor Branch said she had one of the most powerful impacts on the entire scene.
Clark embodied a kind of leadership the cameras never captured. Sociologist Belinda Robnett calls her a bridge leader, the indispensable middle layer that connects ordinary people to a movement's national goals. Clark, Ella Baker, and Daisy Bates all led this way, and the role, Robnett notes, was overwhelmingly female. Women capable of formal leadership were pushed instead into work dismissed as mere support. With quiet dignity and a group-centered faith in people, Clark recognized natural leaders among midwives, draymen, and grandmothers and gave them confidence in themselves. Her citizenship program became the foundation of the 1962 Voter Education Project, a joint effort of SCLC, SNCC, CORE, the NAACP, and the Urban League that registered thousands of Southern Black voters and helped build, county by county, an African-American electorate. Much of this grassroots leadership was forged at one remarkable place, the Highlander Folk School in Monteagle, Tennessee, an integrated retreat where Black and white activists planned together across the color line. It was at Highlander that Septima Clark developed the Citizenship schools, and Highlander that trained organizers who carried the movement home to their own communities. Victoria Gray of Mississippi traveled to a Highlander-style workshop, met Clark, and returned to launch citizenship classes in Hattiesburg, recalling that at the heart of every effective movement in the state were people who had taken the program. Tennessee, threatened by this interracial organizing, shut Highlander down, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference carried its citizenship work forward. The schoolhouse where the powerless learned their power was, the state understood, genuinely dangerous. Mississippi was the closed society. In 1960, the state with the highest proportion of Black residents had disenfranchised nearly all of them, a legacy of its 1890 Constitution. Median Black family income was a third of white income, and most Black Mississippians were trapped in sharecropping. In 1961, a young Harlem organizer, Robert Moses, came at a local activist's request to begin voter registration, and SNCC workers fanned out under the COFO umbrella. To refute the lie that Black people did not care about voting, they staged a mock freedom vote in 1963. Between 80 and 90,000 cast ballots. Then came Freedom Summer of 1964, conceived by Moses with hundreds of Northern students, freedom schools, and community centers. Out of it grew an independent party of farmers and former sharecroppers, with women at its center.
In 1964, Black Mississippians, locked out of the all-white state Democratic Party, built their own. Fannie Lou Hamer, Annie Devine, and Victoria Gray were among the founders of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, organizing among the Black working class, town by town. Vicki Crawford argues that it was these women's spirituality and their formal church networks that sustained the dangerous work. That summer, the MFDP traveled to the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City and demanded to be seated in place of the segregationist regulars. They did not win their seats, but their challenge, broadcast into living rooms across the country, exposed the violence of Mississippi politics and forced the National Party to confront the question of who truly represented the people of the state. Fannie Lou Hamer was the 20th child of Mississippi sharecroppers. The day in 1962 she tried to register to vote, she was evicting from the plantation where she had labored for 18 years. In 1963, returning from a citizenship workshop, she was arrested in Winona, Mississippi, and beaten so savagely in jail that she carried the injuries for life. Chana Kai Lee argues that this anger and memory became the engine of Hamer's power. At Atlantic City in 1964, she told the convention's Credentials Committee about that beating in plain, unforgettable words, asking whether this was America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off the hook because our lives are threatened daily. From a sharecropper's suffering, she forged a moral authority no politician could match. The Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party carried its challenge to the 1964 Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City, demanding to replace the segregationist regulars. Before the Credentials Committee and a national television audience, Fannie Lou Hamer testified. She described the eviction, the jailhouse beating at Winona, and asked whether this was America, the land of the free, where she had to sleep with her telephone off the hook because her life was threatened daily. President Johnson, fearing the South, called a hasty press conference to knock her off the air, and the party offered the MFDP a humiliating compromise of 2 non-voting seats. They refused. "We didn't come all this way for no 2 seats," Hamer said. They did not win, but the nation had seen Mississippi plainly, and the rules of the Democratic Party would never be the same. As the movement turned from integration toward Black power, women navigated a new politics of nationalism, protection, and revolution, often paying its sharpest costs. After 1965, the freedom struggle changed key. Frustrated by the slow returns of integration and the violence that met it, a younger generation turned toward Black power, self-determination, racial pride, and self-defense. For Black women, this shift was double-edged. The nationalist movements gave them a powerful language of dignity and a frontline role in building independent institutions. But they also carried a sharper masculinism, an insistence that Black liberation meant restoring Black manhood, that often pressed women toward the background. The editors gather in this section the women who lived that tension. Gloria Richardson, whose militancy anticipated Black power. Ruby Doris Smith Robinson, who carried SCNC into its nationalist phase. And the women who weighed Malcolm X's promise of protection and claimed their place inside the Black Panther Party. Their task was to be both nationalist and free. In Cambridge, Maryland, Gloria Richardson chaired one of the era's most militant local movements. Sharon Harley calls her essay a chronicle of a death foretold, because Richardson's refusal in 1963 and 1964 to accept nonviolence as the primary strategy foretold the end of the King-led nonviolent phase. As head of the Cambridge Nonviolent Action Committee, she demanded jobs, housing, and health care alongside desegregation, and she urged Black residents to boycott a referendum, refusing to let white voters decide whether Black people deserved their rights. When the National Guard occupied Cambridge, A famous photograph caught her pushing aside a soldier's bayonet with the back of her hand. Harley places this feared up-south warrior squarely in a radical Black activist tradition, running from Harriet Tubman and Ida Wells Barnett to the Black Power militancy her example anticipated.
Cynthia Griggs Fleming tells the story of Ruby Doris Smith Robinson, who joined SNCC in 1961 and rose to become its executive secretary in 1966, the demanding administrative heart of the organization. A veteran of the Rock Hill Jail No Bail protest and the freedom rides, she ran SNCC's day-to-day operations with a toughness that became legendary, managing the staff, the money, and the cars. As Black Power arrived, Fleming shows, Robinson and other women at first accepted certain notions of Black male assertiveness with all their contradictions. But before her death, she had begun to deconstruct the claim that women in leadership were doing a man's job. Robinson died of cancer in 1967 at just 25. Her early death, many believed, was hastened by the relentless burdens she carried for a movement she gave everything.
Farah Jasmine Griffin examines the promise at the center of Black nationalism, that strong Black men would protect Black women. Malcolm X spoke movingly of the Black woman as the most disrespected, unprotected person in America, and vowed that the men of the Nation of Islam would shield her. Many women found dignity and discipline in that promise, but Griffin asks what it cost. Protection, she argues, could come bundled with control, casting women as treasures to be guarded rather than agents in their own right, their worth measured by their service to men and the movement. The ironies of the saint, she calls it, the gap between the reverence Malcolm preached for Black womanhood and the subordinate roles nationalism so often assigned to actual Black women.
Tracy E. Matthews titles her essay with a Panther woman's retort, "No one ever asks what a man's role in the revolution is." By the late 1960s, women were a majority of the Black Panther Party's rank and file, running the free breakfast programs, clinics, and newspaper that defined its community work. Kathleen Cleaver became the party's communications secretary, declaring that it never once entered her head that women could not be leaders. Matthews sets the Panthers' gender debates against the 1966 Moynihan Report, the cultural nationalists and white feminists, showing a party torn between a macho cult of the gun and an official line that condemned male chauvinism and embraced women's liberation. The women in its ranks, she argues, drove that ideological transformation, claiming revolutionary authority and forcing the question of what liberation would mean for them.
The struggle reached the courtroom, the feminist manifesto, and the ballot, as Black women built a politics that was theirs alone. In 1974, Joan Little, a young Black woman jailed in Beaufort County, North Carolina, killed a white jailer with an ice pick as he sexually assaulted her, then fled. Jenna Ray McNeil tells how her 1975 trial became a national cause. Black women saw their own histories in hers. The rallying cry was, "Joanne is you and Joanne is me." Her defense fused the movements of the moment, civil rights, Black power, feminism, and the campaign against the death penalty, and drew on the long, unspoken history of sexual violence against Black women under and after slavery. When the jury acquitted her on grounds of self-defense, it was a landmark, an affirmation that a Black woman had the right to defend her own body and that her life and dignity mattered before the law. Duchess Harris traces how Black women built a feminism of their own. It begins quietly with the Black women appointed to John F. Kennedy's 1961 Commission on the Status of Women, among them Polly Murray and Dorothy Height, who pressed the question of sex discrimination under the 14th Amendment. A decade later, it turned militant. Black women had felt sidelined twice over, marginalized by sexism in the Black freedom movement and by racism in the largely white women's movement. So in 1973, they founded the National Black Feminist Organization to speak for themselves. They named a double jeopardy, the experience of being both Black and female, that neither the civil rights movement nor mainstream feminism had been built to address. Their politics grew directly out of their own lives. The sharpest expression of this new politics came from the Combahee River Collective, a group of Black feminists, among them the writer Barbara Smith, named for Harriet Tubman's 1863 raid that freed hundreds of the enslaved. In 1977, they issued a statement that became a cornerstone of Black feminist thought. The major systems of oppression, they wrote, are interlocking. Race, class, gender, and sexuality cannot be ranked or separated because they are lived all at once. The most profound politics, they insisted, comes directly out of our own identity. And they reached a radical conclusion. If Black women were free, since their freedom would require the destruction of every system of oppression, then everyone else would have to be free as well. It is one of the founding texts of what we now call intersectionality. Linda Faye Williams closes the book by following the movement's legacy into electoral politics. The struggles of the civil rights and Black Power years opened the ballot and the candidacy to African American women at every level, from city councils and school boards to state houses and Congress. Shirley Chisholm, the first Black woman elected to Congress in 1968 and a candidate for president in 1972, ran unbought and unbossed and embodied the new possibility. Williams documents the steady growth in the number of Black women holding office, a direct dividend of the voter registration drives, the freedom schools, and the organizing that women had led for half a century. The sisters who could not speak at the March on Washington had, within a generation, begun to speak from the floors of legislatures. Read together, these 16 stories rewrite the freedom movement. They show that its decisive work was often the patient, unglamorous labor of women, registering voters one fearful household at a time, teaching grandmothers to read, keeping the books and dispatching the cars. They show Black women carrying a double burden and forging from it a distinct political vision. The bridge leadership of Ella Baker and Septima Clark, the moral fire of Fannie Lou Hamer, the intersectional analysis of Combahee. That vision did not end in 1980. It runs forward through every Black woman who has since organized a community, argued a case, or won an election, and through a feminism that finally takes race, class, and gender as one. The sisters in the struggle built the bridge the rest of us still walk across. From Mary McLeod Bethune's Closed Doors to Shirley Chisholm's seat in Congress, Sisters in the Struggle recovers the women who carried the freedom movement on their backs. They organized the boycotts, taught the freedom schools, founded the parties, ran the breakfast programs, and wrote the manifestos. And they did it while bearing the double handicap of race and sex. Often denied the microphone, they were nonetheless, as Dorothy Height said, the backbone of the movement. Their story is one of patient institution building and fearless confrontation, of bridge leaders and revolutionaries, of women who, in the whip of the whirlwind, conducted their blooming admirably. To remember them fully is to finally tell the freedom struggle whole.